Welcome to another journey through calm history. Tonight we explore the slow, repetitive rhythms of medieval village life. These ancient routines from centuries past will guide you into peaceful sleep through the gentle cadence of historical detail. Let us begin with dawn in a typical English village during the 13th century. The medieval day started with the ringing of church bells. These bells marked the canonical hours observed by the monastery. The first bell rang for matins, approximately 3 hours before sunrise. Most villagers ignored this early call. They remained in their beds until the bell for prime, which rang at sunrise. Medieval beds were simple constructions. The poorest villagers slept on straw pallets placed directly on dirt floors. These pallets were thin mattresses stuffed with straw, hay, or dried leaves. The straw had to be changed regularly to prevent rot and infestation. Better-off peasants owned wooden bed frames. These frames raised the sleeping surface above the cold, damp floor. Medieval blankets were made from rough wool. This wool came from local sheep. The sheep were sheared once per year, usually in late spring. The wool was then cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. This process took months of labor. A single blanket represented weeks of work by village women. Medieval houses were dark and cold. They had few windows. Glass was extremely expensive. Most windows were simply openings in walls. These openings could be covered with wooden shutters, animal skins, or oiled cloth. During winter, families chose between light and warmth. Open windows provided light but let in cold air. Closed windows kept out cold but made houses dark. The medieval fireplace was the center of village homes. These fireplaces were large stone constructions built into one wall. They provided heat, light, and a place for cooking. However, they were inefficient. Most heat escaped up the chimney. Smoke often filled the room when wind blew down the chimney. Medieval families gathered around the fire during cold evenings, but the rest of the house remained frigid. Medieval fuel consisted primarily of wood. Villages were surrounded by forests that provided abundant timber. However, good firewood required careful selection and preparation. Green wood produced too much smoke. Rotten wood burned too quickly. The best firewood came from hardwood trees that had been cut and dried for at least 1 year. Collecting firewood was a constant necessity. Village children spent hours each day gathering fallen branches and twigs. Adult men cut down trees and split logs. Women bundled smaller pieces for kindling. This work continued throughout the year. Families who failed to collect enough would face cold, hungry winters. Medieval villagers woke gradually as dawn approached. The first to rise were the monks in nearby monasteries. They rang bells for the morning prayer service called lauds. This bell woke the village priest, who began preparing for the morning mass. Slowly, other villagers stirred in their beds and began their daily routines. Medieval morning routines were simple but essential. People relieved themselves in chamber pots or outdoor latrines. They washed their faces and hands with cold water from wooden bowls. They dressed in the same clothes they had worn the previous day. Clean clothes were a luxury most villagers could not afford. Medieval clothing was practical and durable. Men wore long tunics made of rough wool or linen. These tunics reached to the knees or ankles. Over the tunic, men wore short jackets, called doublets. Women wore long dresses, called kirtles. These dresses reached to the ground and had long sleeves. Both men and women wore cloaks for warmth and protection from rain. Medieval shoes were expensive luxuries. Most villagers went barefoot during warm weather. In winter, they wrapped their feet in cloth or leather strips. Wealthy peasants owned wooden clogs or leather shoes. These shoes were repaired repeatedly until they fell apart completely. New shoes might cost a month's wages for an ordinary peasant. Medieval breakfast was a simple meal, if eaten at all. Many villagers broke their fast with a piece of bread and a cup of ale. The bread was dark and coarse, made from barley, oats, or rye. Wheat bread was too expensive for common people. The ale was weak and served as a substitute for water, which was often contaminated. Medieval bread was the foundation of the peasant diet. A typical adult consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day. This bread provided most of their calories and nutrition. Baking bread was a complex process that required considerable skill and equipment. Most villagers took their grain to the village baker rather than attempting to bake at home. Medieval grain had to be ground into flour before it could be used for baking. This grinding was done at the village mill. The mill was usually owned by the local lord. Peasants were required to use the lord's mill and pay a fee for the service. This fee, called multure, was typically 1/16 of the grain being ground. Medieval mills were powered by water or wind. Water mills were built beside streams or rivers. The flowing water turned large wooden wheels connected to grinding stones. Windmills used large cloth sails to catch the wind. Both types of mills required constant maintenance and repair. Millers were skilled craftsmen who understood the complex mechanisms. Medieval millers occupied an important position in village society. They controlled an essential service that everyone needed. However, they were often distrusted and disliked. Villagers suspected millers of cheating them by taking more than the proper fee. Popular sayings warned about dishonest millers who allegedly stole grain while pretending to measure it accurately. Medieval farming began at sunrise when the church bell rang for prime. This bell signaled the start of the working day for most villagers. Farmers gathered their tools and headed to the fields. The type of work depended on the season, weather, and crops being grown. Medieval agriculture followed a 3-field system. This system divided village farmland into 3 large fields. Each year, one field grew wheat or rye, another grew barley or oats, and the third left. The following year, the crops rotated to different fields. This rotation helped maintain soil fertility, but limited overall productivity. Medieval plowing was hard, slow work. Peasants used wooden plows pulled by oxen. These plows had iron tips called plowshares that cut through the soil. A team of 2 to 8 oxen was needed depending on soil conditions. Oxen were expensive animals that most peasants could not afford individually. Village families often shared oxen and worked together during plowing season. Medieval oxen were large, powerful animals specifically bred for farm work. They were stronger than horses, but much slower. Oxen could work all day without tiring, but they moved at a walking pace. A good team of oxen could plow about 1 acre per day under ideal conditions. Poor soil, wet weather, or broken equipment could reduce this dramatically. Medieval plowing required considerable skill. The furrows had to be straight and uniform depth. Too shallow and weeds would grow easily. Too deep and seeds would not germinate properly. Experienced plowmen could judge soil conditions by feel and adjust their technique accordingly. This skill was learned through years of practice and observation. Medieval sowing was done by hand. Farmers carried seeds in cloth sacks or wicker baskets. They walked slowly across plowed fields, throwing handfuls of seeds in regular patterns. Good sowing required steady rhythm and careful spacing. Too many seeds in one area wasted valuable grain. Too few seeds meant poor harvest. Medieval seeds were saved from the previous year's harvest. Farmers carefully selected the best grain for planting. This seed grain was stored in dry places and protected from mice and insects. However, medieval storage methods were primitive. Much seed grain was lost to rot, pests, or poor weather. Failed harvests sometimes left villagers without adequate seed for the following year. Medieval harrowing followed sowing. This process broke up large clods of earth and covered seeds with soil. Harrows were wooden frames with iron teeth or spikes. They were dragged across fields by oxen or horses. Proper harrowing helped seeds germinate and protected them from birds and wind. Medieval weeding was constant. Back-breaking work. Weeds competed with crops for nutrients and water. They had to be removed by hand or with simple tools like hoes. Weeding was typically done by women and children. They spent long days crawling through fields, pulling weeds one by one. This work continued throughout the growing season. Medieval fertilizer consisted mainly of animal manure. Cows, horses, pigs, and sheep provided dung that was spread on fields. Human waste was also used, though this was considered unpleasant work. Gathering and spreading manure was essential for maintaining soil fertility. Villages without enough animals often had poor harvests due to depleted soil. Medieval crop rotation included growing legumes like peas and beans. These plants helped restore nutrients to the soil. However, medieval farmers did not understand the science behind this process. They followed traditional practices passed down through generations. These traditions were sometimes effective, but often based on superstition rather than observation. Medieval harvesting was the most important time of year. The success or failure of the harvest determined whether villagers would have enough food for the coming winter. Harvest work required all available labor. Everyone from small children to elderly grandparents participated in cutting, gathering, and storing grain. Medieval harvesting tools were simple but effective. The main tool was a sickle, a curved blade attached to a short handle. Harvesters grasped grain stalks with one hand and cut them with the sickle. This was slow work that required bending over for hours. A skilled harvester could cut about half an acre per day. Medieval grain was cut when it was fully ripe, but before it became too dry. Timing was critical. Cut too early and the grain would not store well. Cut too late and grain would fall from the stalks and be lost. Weather could ruin a harvest in a matter of days. Rain could cause grain to rot or sprout. Strong winds could blow ripe grain from the stalks. Medieval threshing separated grain from stalks. This was done by beating harvested grain with wooden tools called flails. Flails consisted of a long handle connected to a shorter striking piece by leather or rope. Workers struck the grain repeatedly until seeds separated from stalks. This work was dusty, tiring, and time-consuming. Medieval winnowing removed chaff from grain. This was done by tossing threshed grain into the air on windy days. The wind blew away light chaff while heavier grain fell to the ground. Winnowing required good timing and favorable weather. Calm days made the process impossible. Too much wind scattered grain and chaff together. Medieval storage of grain was a constant challenge. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent rot. It had to be protected from mice, rats, and insects. Storage containers included wooden barrels, clay pots, and woven baskets. These containers were often lined with straw or cloth. Despite these precautions, significant amounts of stored grain were lost to spoilage and pests. Medieval barns were built specifically for grain storage. These buildings had thick walls and raised floors to keep out moisture and rodents. Grain was stored in large wooden bins or spread on floors. Regular inspection was necessary to detect signs of spoilage or infestation. Spoiled grain had to be removed quickly to prevent contamination of the entire supply. Medieval household management required careful planning and constant labor. The medieval housewife supervised numerous daily tasks that kept the family fed, clothed, and sheltered. These responsibilities demanded considerable skill and knowledge passed down through generations of women. Medieval cooking was done over open fires in large fireplaces. Pots hung from iron hooks or chains above the flames. Cooking fires had to be maintained constantly during daylight hours. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. Most families kept embers burning overnight and rekindled them each morning. Medieval cooking pots were made of iron or clay. Iron pots were expensive but durable. They could withstand high heat and rough handling. Clay pots were cheaper but fragile. They cracked easily and had to be replaced frequently. A typical household owned only a few cooking vessels that served multiple purposes. Medieval meals were simple and repetitive. The main dish was usually pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever ingredients were available. Pottage might contain grains, vegetables, herbs, and occasionally small pieces of meat. The recipe changed according to the season and the family's economic situation. Medieval pottage was cooked in large quantities and eaten for several days. The pot was rarely emptied completely. New ingredients were added daily, creating a constantly changing mixture. This cooking method made efficient use of fuel and cooking vessels. However, it also meant that food sometimes spoiled or developed unpleasant flavors. Medieval vegetables were grown in small gardens near houses. These gardens produced onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and peas. Herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme were grown for flavoring and medicine. Gardens required daily attention, including watering, weeding, and protection from animals and insects. Medieval preservation of food was essential for winter survival. Vegetables were dried, salted, or pickled in vinegar. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried into jerky. Fruits were dried or made into preserves with honey. These preservation methods changed the taste and texture of food, but allowed families to eat. Throughout the winter months, medieval brewing was primarily women's work. Ale was the common drink for all family members, including children. Water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink. Ale was safer because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. However, medieval people did not understand the science behind this process. Medieval ale was made from malted barley, water, and herbs. The barley was soaked in water until it sprouted, then dried and ground into meal. This meal was mixed with hot water and allowed to ferment. Herbs like hops were added for flavor and preservation. The entire process took several days and required careful attention. Medieval bread baking was usually done in communal ovens. These large stone ovens were built and maintained by the village community. Individual families brought their bread dough to be baked. The baker charged a fee for this service. Baking day was a social occasion when women gathered to share news and gossip. Medieval textile production was another important household task. Women spun wool into thread using simple spindles. This thread was then woven into cloth on wooden looms. The process was extremely time-consuming. A skilled woman might produce only a few yards of cloth per week. Medieval spinning was done with a spindle and distaff. The distaff held raw wool fibers. The spindle twisted these fibers into thread. This work could be done while walking or performing other tasks. Women carried their spindles everywhere and spun thread during any available moment. Medieval weaving required a loom, a wooden frame that held threads in place. The weaver passed thread over and under these fixed threads to create cloth. Weaving was skilled work that required practice and patience. Mistakes could ruin days or weeks of labor. Complex patterns demanded years of experience to master. Medieval dyeing added color to plain wool cloth. Dyes came from plants, minerals, and insects. Common colors included brown from walnut hulls, yellow from onion skins, and red from madder root. Blue dye was particularly valuable and came from woad plants. The dyeing process was complex and often produced unpredictable results. Medieval laundry was hard work done with primitive tools. Clothes were washed in streams or large wooden tubs. Soap was made from animal fat and ash. The washing process required pounding clothes with wooden paddles and scrubbing them on rough stones. Clean water was carried in heavy buckets from wells or streams. Medieval drying of clothes depended entirely on weather. Wet clothes were spread on bushes or hung on wooden frames. During rainy periods, clothes might take days to dry. Families needed multiple sets of clothing to ensure clean, dry garments were always available. However, most villagers owned only one or two complete outfits. Medieval mending and repair of clothes was constant work. Cloth was expensive and had to last as long as possible. Women spent hours darning holes, patching tears, and reinforcing weak areas. Completely worn-out garments were cut up and used as patches for newer clothes. Nothing was wasted. Medieval household tools were simple and made to last. Cooking implements included wooden spoons, iron knives, and clay bowls. Cleaning tools included brooms made from bundled twigs and rough cloths for wiping surfaces. These tools were handmade by village craftsmen or family members. Medieval furniture was sparse and functional. Most families owned a wooden table, a few stools, and perhaps a chest for storing valuable items. Beds were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses. The wealthy might own chairs, but most people sat on benches or the floor. Furniture was built to last for generations. Medieval village crafts were essential for daily life. Each village had skilled craftsmen who provided tools, containers, and other necessary items. These craftsmen learnt their trades through long apprenticeships and passed their knowledge to the next generation through the guild system. Medieval blacksmiths were among the most important village craftsmen. They forged iron tools and weapons using simple furnaces and hand tools. The blacksmith's forge was built of stone and clay. It burned charcoal to reach the high temperatures needed to work iron. Bellows made from animal skins provided air to keep the fire hot. Medieval blacksmithing required great skill and strength. The blacksmith heated iron in the forge until it glowed red hot. Then he hammered it into shape on an iron anvil. This process was repeated many times to form complex tools. A simple horseshoe required dozens of hammer blows and careful attention to temperature and timing. Medieval tools made by blacksmiths included plowshares, axes, knives, and nails. Each tool was forged individually by hand. No two items were exactly alike. The quality depended on the blacksmith's skill and the purity of the iron. Good tools were valuable. Possessions that lasted for decades with proper care. Bad medieval iron was produced in small furnaces called bloomeries. Iron ore was heated with charcoal to remove impurities. This process produced a spongy mass of iron called a bloom. The bloom was hammered repeatedly to remove slag and improve the metal's quality. Medieval iron was generally softer and more brittle than modern steel. Medieval carpenters built houses, furniture, and wooden tools. They used hand tools, including saws, chisels, planes, and axes. All work was powered by human muscle. A simple wooden chest might require several days of skilled labor. Complex structures, like houses, took weeks or months to complete. Medieval wood came from local forests and had to be carefully selected and prepared. Green wood was too soft and would warp as it dried. Old wood was often rotten or infected with insects. The best timber came from trees that had been cut and seasoned for at least 1 year. Different types of wood were used for different purposes. Medieval carpentry joints were cut by hand and fitted together without nails or screws. Common joints included mortise and tenon, dovetail, and lap joints. These joints had to fit perfectly to create strong connections. Skilled carpenters could judge measurements by eye and cut joints that lasted for centuries. Medieval potters made clay vessels for cooking, storage, and serving food. They dug clay from local deposits and prepared it by removing stones and other impurities. The clay was kneaded thoroughly to make it smooth and workable. Pottery was shaped by hand or on simple wheels turned by foot power. Medieval pottery was fired in kilns built of stone and clay. The kiln had to reach specific temperatures to harden the clay properly. Too little heat left pottery soft and fragile. Too much heat could crack or melt the vessels. Controlling kiln temperature required experience and careful attention to fuel and airflow. Medieval glazing gave pottery a smooth, waterproof surface. Glaze was made from ground minerals mixed with water. Pottery was dipped in glaze before the final firing. The heat melted the glaze into a glassy coating. However, glaze materials were expensive and not all pottery was glazed. Most everyday vessels had rough, porous surfaces. Medieval coopering was the craft of making wooden barrels and buckets. Coopers selected wood staves and shaped them precisely to fit together. The staves were held in place by iron hoops hammered tightly round the barrel. This work required mathematical precision and considerable physical strength. Medieval barrels were essential for storing and transporting liquids. They held ale, wine, oil, and other precious commodities. A well-made barrel was watertight and could last for many years. Poor workmanship resulted in leaks that wasted valuable contents. Skilled coopers were highly valued craftsmen. Medieval tanning converted animal hides into leather. This process took several months and involved numerous steps. Hides were soaked in lime water to remove hair and flesh. Then they were treated with bark extracts that contained tannins. The entire process produced terrible smells and was usually done outside villages. Medieval leather was used for shoes, belts, saddles, and containers. Different treatments produced different types of leather. Thick, stiff leather was used for shoe soles and saddles. Thin, flexible leather was used for gloves and clothing. The quality of leather depended on the animal's age, diet, and the tanner's skill. Medieval weaving was done by women on simple looms in their homes. These looms were wooden frames that held threads in place. The weaver passed thread over and under these fixed threads to create cloth. This work was slow and required constant attention. A skilled weaver might produce several yards of cloth per week. Medieval cloth was made primarily from wool and linen. Wool came from sheep and was warm but heavy. Linen came from flax plants and was lighter but more expensive. Both materials required extensive processing before they could be woven. This processing included cleaning, combing, spinning, and dyeing. Medieval tailoring transformed cloth into clothing. Tailors cut fabric pieces and sewed them together by hand. All sewing was done with needle and thread. A simple tunic required several days of work. Complex garments with fitted sleeves and decorative elements took weeks to complete. Medieval measuring and fitting of clothes was done by eye and experience. There were no standard sizes or precise measuring tools. Tailors judged proportions and made adjustments during construction. Clothes often fitted poorly by modern standards. Loose, shapeless garments were more practical than tight-fitting ones. Medieval prices for crafted goods were regulated by guilds. These organizations controlled who could practice each trade and set standards for quality and pricing. Guild members were required to serve apprenticeships and demonstrate their skills before becoming independent craftsmen. This system protected consumers but limited innovation and competition. Medieval social structure was rigid and hierarchical. Everyone had a specific place in society determined by birth. Social mobility was extremely limited. Most people lived and died in the same social class as their parents. This system was believed to be ordained by God and therefore UNCHANGEABLE. Medieval feudalism was the foundation of social organization. At the top was the king, who owned all land. Below him were nobles who held land in exchange for military service. Below the nobles were knights who fought on horseback. At the bottom were peasants who worked the land and provided food for everyone else. Medieval peasants were divided into different categories. Villains were bound to the land and could not leave without permission. They owed labor service to their lord several days each week. Cotters owned small plots of land but also owed service. Serfs were the lowest category and were essentially slaves tied to the manor. Medieval manors were self-sufficient economic units. Each manor included the lord's house, peasant cottages, farmland, forests, and often a mill and church. The manor produced most of what its inhabitants needed. Trade with other manors was limited to items that could not be produced. Locally, medieval lords held absolute power over their peasants. They could demand labor service, collect taxes, and administer justice. Peasants who disobeyed could be fined, beaten, or imprisoned. However, lords also had obligations to protect their peasants and provide land for farming. This mutual obligation was the basis of feudal society. Medieval labor service was a major burden for peasants. Villains typically owed 3 days of work per week on the lord's land. During busy seasons like planting and harvesting, they might be required to work every day. This labor service was called week work and was carefully monitored by the lords. Officials. Medieval peasants also owed special services called boon work. These included extra labor during harvesting, carrying messages, and maintaining roads and bridges. Boon work was an addition to regular week work and could not be refused. Peasants who failed to perform required service were punished severely. Medieval taxation took many forms beyond labor service. Peasants paid rent for their land, usually in the form of grain or livestock. They paid fees to use the lord's mill, oven, and wine press. They paid taxes on marriages, inheritances, and even the right to leave the manor temporarily. Medieval justice was administered by the lord or his officials. Minor crimes were tried in manor courts held weekly or monthly. More serious crimes were handled by higher courts. Punishments included fines, public humiliation, physical punishment, and death. There was no presumption of innocence or right to legal representation. Medieval manor courts handled disputes between peasants. These might involve property boundaries, unpaid debts, or personal conflicts. The court also enforced manor rules and customs. Peasants served as jurors and helped decide cases. However, the Lord Steward controlled the proceedings and could override decisions. Medieval punishment for crimes was public and designed to deter others. Minor offenses resulted in time in the stocks or pillage. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Murderers were hanged. These punishments were carried out in public places where everyone could watch. The brutality was intended to discourage criminal behavior. Medieval marriage among peasants required the lord's permission. This permission came with a fee called mer. The lord wanted to ensure that valuable workers did not leave the manor. Marriage between peasants from different manors was complicated and expensive. Many peasants remained unmarried because they could not afford the fees. Medieval inheritance was strictly controlled. When a peasant died, his land passed to his eldest son. The son had to pay a fee called harriet to take possession. This fee was often the family's best animal or most valuable possession. Younger sons usually became laborers or left to seek work elsewhere. Medieval women had very limited rights. They could not own property independently or make legal contracts. Unmarried women were controlled by their fathers. Married women were controlled by their husbands. Widows had slightly more freedom but were still subject to the lord's authority and social pressure to remarry. Medieval education was available only to the wealthy and clergy. Most peasants could not read or write. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition and hands-on training. Children learned farming, crafts, and household skills by watching and helping their parents. Formal schooling was unknown in most villages. Medieval church played a central role in village life. The parish priest was often the only educated person in the village. He conducted religious services, performed marriages and funerals, and sometimes taught basic reading to wealthy children. The church building served as a community center for meetings and celebrations. Medieval religious obligations were numerous and complex. Peasants were required to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days. They had to pay tithes, which amounted to 10% of their income. They were expected to confess their sins regularly and perform penance assigned by the priest. Medieval superstitions influenced daily life. People believed in witches, demons, and evil spirits. They used charms and rituals to protect themselves from harm. Medical treatment often included prayers and religious ceremonies, along with herbal remedies. The boundary between religion and superstition was often unclear. Medieval entertainment was simple and community-based. Villagers gathered for seasonal festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations. These events included dancing, singing, storytelling, and simple games. Professional entertainers like minstrels and jugglers occasionally visited villages. Most entertainment was homemade and participatory. Medieval festivals followed the agricultural calendar. Harvest festivals celebrated successful crops. Spring festivals welcomed warmer weather and renewed growth. Winter festivals provided light and warmth during the darkest months. These celebrations helped communities bond and provided relief from daily hardships. Medieval village governance was handled by elected officials called reeves. The reeve represented peasant interests to the lord and supervised daily work assignments. This position was unpopular because it required mediating between the lord's demands and peasant complaints. Reeves were often chosen by rotation rather than volunteers. Medieval religious life permeated every aspect of village existence. The church calendar determined work schedules, social activities, and personal behavior. Religious observance was not optional but required by both civil and ecclesiastical law. Failure to attend services or pay tithes resulted in punishment and social ostracism. Medieval parish churches were built of stone and designed to last for centuries. These buildings dominated village skylines and represented the largest investment of community resources. Construction often took decades and required contributions from every family. The church buildings served multiple purposes beyond religious services. Medieval church bells regulated daily life in villages. Different bell patterns announced specific times for work, meals, and prayers. The bells rang for dawn prayers, called matins, morning prayers called prime, midday prayers called sext, evening prayers called vespers, and night prayers called compline. Villagers organized their activities around these regular signals. Medieval priests were usually the only literate people in villages. They could read Latin and often spoke multiple languages. However, their education was limited to religious subjects. Many priests knew little about medicine, law, or practical skills. Their primary duties were conducting religious services and providing moral guidance. Medieval tithing was a religious tax that supported the church. Every household owed 1/10 of their annual production to the parish. This tithe was collected in the form of grain, livestock, or other goods. Tithe collection was strictly enforced. Families who could not pay in full often went into debt or lost their land. Medieval confession was required of all Christians at least once per year. Peasants told the priest about their sins and received penance in the form of prayers, fasting, or charitable works. The priest was supposed to keep confession secret, but this rule was sometimes broken. Fear of public exposure influenced people's behavior and created social pressure for conformity. Medieval pilgrimages were religious journeys to holy sites. Local destinations included nearby monasteries or shrines. Longer pilgrimages went to Canterbury, Rome, or even Jerusalem. These journeys were expensive and dangerous. Most peasants could not afford to travel far from home. However, they might visit local shrines on feast days. Medieval monasteries were centers of learning and economic activity. Monks preserved ancient texts through hand copying. They developed new agricultural techniques and provided medical care. Monasteries owned large amounts of land and employed many peasants. However, relations between monks and villagers were not always harmonious. Medieval religious festivals provided entertainment and social bonding. Christmas celebrations lasted for 12 days and included feasting, dancing, and gift. Easter was preceded by the fasting season of Lent. Harvest festivals combined religious thanksgiving with community celebration. These events broke the monotony of daily labor. Medieval saints' days were numerous and varied. Each saint had a specific area of expertise and could be called upon for help with particular problems. Saint Christopher protected travelers. Saint Anthony helped find lost objects. Saint Blaise cured throat ailments. Peasants often prayed to multiple saints for different needs. Medieval religious art decorated church interiors. Wall paintings depicted biblical scenes and moral lessons. These images served as visual instruction for illiterate peasants. Stained glass windows created beautiful colored light. Stone carvings showed religious figures and symbols. This art was expensive, but considered essential for proper worship. Medieval. Church music was an important part of religious services. Gregorian chant was sung by priests and choir members. Peasants knew simple hymns and responses. Musical instruments were limited to organs in wealthy churches. Most village churches relied entirely on vocal music. The acoustics of stone buildings enhanced the musical. Experience. Medieval religious education was limited to basic instruction. Children learned simple prayers and religious stories. They memorized the 10 Commandments and other essential teachings. More advanced education was available only to those preparing for religious careers. Most peasants knew enough religion to fulfill their obligations, but little more. Medieval heresy was considered a serious crime. People who questioned church teachings or practices faced prosecution. Heretics could be excommunicated, fined, imprisoned, or even executed. The fear of being accused of heresy discouraged open discussion of religious matters. Conformity was safer than independent thinking. Medieval church law governed many aspects of daily life. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, and contracts were subject to religious rules. Church courts handled cases involving clergy and religious matters. These courts often competed with secular courts for jurisdiction. Canon law sometimes conflicted with local customs and created confusion. Medieval. Religious relics were considered sacred objects with miraculous powers. These might include pieces of saints' bones, clothing, or personal possessions. Churches competed to acquire important relics because they attracted pilgrims and donations. However, many relics were fraudulent. The same saint's bones might be displayed in dozens of different churches. Medieval superstitions blended with official religious teachings. People believed that certain prayers could control weather or cure diseases. They thought that holy water could drive away evil spirits. Blessed objects were carried for protection against harm. These beliefs were discouraged by educated clergy, but persisted among common people. Medieval religious processions marked important occasions. The entire village participated in Easter and Christmas processions. These events included carrying religious banners, singing hymns, and displaying sacred objects. Processions reinforced community solidarity and demonstrated public devotion. They also provided opportunities for social interaction and celebration. Medieval church attendance was mandatory for all Christians. Missing Sunday Mass without valid excuse resulted in punishment. The church building had to accommodate the entire village population. Services were conducted in Latin, which most peasants did not understand. However, they could follow familiar rituals and respond to cues from the priest. Medieval religious charity was considered essential for salvation. Wealthy villagers were expected to give alms to the poor. Churches maintained funds for supporting widows, orphans, and disabled people. However, charitable resources were limited. Many needy people received little help. The church taught that poverty was part of God's plan and should be accepted patiently. Medieval, seasonal activities followed natural rhythms that had remained unchanged for centuries. Each season brought specific tasks that were essential for survival. These activities required careful timing and community cooperation. Failure to complete seasonal work properly could result in starvation or death during the harsh winter months. Medieval spring began with the preparation of fields for planting. This work started as soon as the ground thawed sufficiently for ploughing. Peasants examined their tools and repaired damage from winter storage. Broken plowshares were taken to the blacksmith for mending. Harness leather was oiled and stitched. Oxen were checked for lameness or injury. Medieval ploughing in spring was back-breaking work that required long days in muddy fields. The soil was often heavy with moisture and difficult to break. Oxen struggled to pull ploughs through wet, sticky earth. Workers walked behind the ploughs, guiding them and removing stones or roots that blocked progress. A single field might require weeks of steady labor. Medieval sowing of spring crops required careful timing. Seeds planted too early might be killed by late frosts. Seeds planted too late might not have enough time to mature before harvest. Experienced farmers watched for signs in nature that indicated proper planting time. They observed bird migration, plant growth, and weather patterns to make decisions. Medieval spring cleaning was an annual necessity. Houses that had been closed against winter cold were opened and aired. Straw from floors was removed and burned. Walls were scrubbed with brushes and water. Clothing and bedding were washed and dried in the warming sun. This work removed accumulated dirt and helped prevent disease. Medieval summer brought the busiest time of year for agricultural work. Crops required constant attention during their growing season. Weeding was a daily task that occupied women and children for long hours. Fields had to be protected from birds, insects, and wandering animals. Fences were repaired and ditches cleaned to channel water properly. Medieval haymaking was crucial for providing winter feed for livestock. Grass was cut with scythes and left to dry in the sun. The dried hay was gathered into bundles and stored in barns. This work had to be completed quickly because rain could ruin hay that was left in the fields. Entire families worked together during haymaking season. Medieval summer also brought opportunities for additional food gathering. Wild berries, nuts, and herbs were collected from forests and fields. These foods provided variety in the diet and essential nutrients. Children were especially useful for this work because they could reach into thorny bushes and climb trees that adults could not navigate. Medieval harvest season began in late summer and continued into early autumn. This was the most critical time of year because the success or failure of crops determined whether families would survive the winter. Every available person participated. In harvest work, from small children to elderly grandparents, even pregnant women and sick people helped when possible. Medieval grain harvest followed a specific sequence of activities. First, the grain was cut with sickles or scythes. Then it was gathered into bundles called sheaves. The sheaves were left in fields to dry completely. Finally, they were loaded onto carts and transported to barns for storage. Each step required careful attention to prevent losses. Medieval threshing separated grain kernels from their stalks. This work was done with flails, which were wooden. Tools consisting of a long handle connected to a shorter striking piece. Workers beat the dried grain repeatedly until the kernels separated. Threshing was dusty, exhausting work that continued for weeks after the initial harvest. Medieval winnowing removed chaff and debris from threshed grain. This was accomplished by pouring grain from baskets on windy days. The wind blew away light chaff while heavier grain kernels fell to the ground. Winnowing required good weather and careful technique. Poor winnowing resulted in grain that was difficult to store and grind. Medieval autumn brought additional harvesting activities. Apples, pears, and other tree fruits were gathered and stored. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were dug from gardens. Nuts were collected from forest trees. These foods provided essential nutrition during winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Medieval slaughtering of livestock typically occurred in late autumn. Animals that could not be fed through winter were killed and processed. This provided fresh meat for immediate consumption and preserved meat for later use. Slaughtering was skilled work that required knowledge of butchering techniques and food preservation methods. Medieval food preservation became urgent as winter approached. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried to prevent spoilage. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented in salt brine. Fruits were dried or cooked into preserves with honey. These preservation methods changed the taste and texture of foods, but made winter survival possible. Medieval winter preparation included gathering fuel for heating and cooking. Firewood had to be cut, split, and stacked in dry locations. Families that failed to collect adequate fuel faced cold, miserable winters. Dead branches and fallen trees were gathered first. Live trees were cut only when other sources were exhausted. Medieval winter housing preparation involved sealing gaps in walls and roofs. Mud and straw were used to fill cracks that let in cold air. Additional layers of thatch might be added to roofs. Windows were covered with shutters, animal skins, or woven mats. These improvements helped conserve heat during the coldest months. Medieval winter clothing preparation required careful planning. Woolen garments were cleaned and repaired before cold weather arrived. Additional layers were sewn for extra warmth. Fur-lined cloaks and mittens were prepared for outdoor work. Families that neglected clothing preparation suffered from cold and exposure. During winter months, medieval winter activities were limited by short daylight hours and harsh weather. Indoor work included spinning, weaving, and tool repair. Food preparation took longer because of the need to thaw frozen supplies. Livestock required daily care, including feeding, watering, and shelter maintenance. Travel was dangerous and often impossible during severe weather. Medieval technology was simple but effective for the time period. Most tools and machines were made of wood, iron, and leather, using techniques that had remained unchanged for centuries. Innovation was rare and often viewed with suspicion. Traditional methods were preferred because they were proven to work and required no additional investment or training. Medieval water mills were among the most sophisticated machines in village life. These mills used flowing water to turn large wooden wheels connected to grinding stones. The wheel was fitted with wooden paddles that caught the stream flow. Gears made of wood and iron transferred the rotational motion to the grinding mechanism inside the mill. Building. Medieval mill construction required considerable engineering skill. The mill race had to be dug to channel water from a stream or river to the wheel. Wooden sluices controlled water flow and could shut down the mill when necessary. The building had to be positioned precisely to align the wheel with the grinding stones. Poor construction resulted in inefficient operation or frequent breakdowns. Medieval windmills appeared later than water mills, but served similar purposes. These structures used large cloth sails to capture wind energy. The sails were mounted on wooden frames that could be adjusted to face the wind. Gears inside the mill building transferred wind power to grinding stones. Windmills were useful in areas without suitable streams for water. Mills. Medieval mill operation required skilled millers who understood the complex machinery. They adjusted water flow or sail position to maintain proper grinding speed. Too fast, and the grain would be pulverized into unusable powder. Too slow, and the grinding would be incomplete. Millers also maintained the machinery by replacing worn parts and lubricating moving components. Medieval plows were essential tools that had evolved slowly over many centuries. The basic design consisted of a wooden frame fitted with an iron plowshare that cut through soil. A wooden moldboard turned the cut soil aside to create furrows. The plow was pulled by oxen or horses using leather harnesses and wooden yokes. Medieval plow design varied according to local soil conditions. Heavy clay soils required large, strong plows with multiple oxen. Light sandy soils could be worked with smaller plows pulled by horses. Some regions used wheeled plows that were easier to maneuver. Others preferred simple plows without wheels that were lighter and less expensive. Medieval harrows were used after plowing to break up large clods of earth. These tools consisted of wooden frames fitted with iron teeth or wooden spikes. The harrow was dragged across plowed fields by oxen or horses. This process smoothed the soil surface and covered seeds that had been scattered by hand. Medieval carts and wagons provided transportation for people and goods. These vehicles had wooden wheels fitted with iron rims for durability. The wheels were attached to wooden axles that turned in simple bearings. Cart bodies were made of wood and could be removed for different purposes. Most carts were pulled by oxen, which were strong but slow. Medieval wheelwrights built and repaired wheels using traditional techniques. They selected seasoned wood for spokes and rims. The pieces were fitted together with wooden joints and iron reinforcements. Wheel construction required precise measurements and skilled craftsmanship. A poorly made wheel would break under load and could cause serious accidents. Medieval blacksmith tools were simple but effective. For working iron, the forge was a stone hearth that burned charcoal to create intense heat. Bellows made from animal skins provided air to maintain high temperatures. Hammers of various sizes shaped hot iron on anvils. Tongs held hot metal safely while it was being worked. Medieval anvils were massive blocks of iron that provided a solid surface for hammering. Good anvils were expensive and were often passed down through generations of blacksmiths. The anvil had a flat surface for general work and a pointed projection called a horn for shaping curved objects. The quality of the anvil significantly affected the blacksmith's ability to produce good work. Medieval carpentry tools included saws, chisels, planes, and measuring devices. Saws had iron blades with hand-cut teeth. Chisels were used for cutting precise joints and decorative details. Planes smoothed rough wood surfaces. Measuring was done with marked sticks or knotted ropes. All cutting was powered by human muscle. Medieval building construction used traditional techniques that required no mechanical aids. Stone walls were built by stacking carefully shaped blocks. Mortar made from lime and sand held the stones in place. Wooden beams supported floors and roofs. Thatch made from straw or red provided weatherproof roofing material. Medieval rope and cordage were made from plant fibers twisted together. Hemp and flax were common materials for strong rope. Straw and grass were used for lighter cordage. Rope making was skilled work that required selecting proper materials and twisting them with the right tension. Poor rope could break unexpectedly and cause injury or property damage. Medieval pottery wheels were simple devices that spun clay while it was being shaped. The wheel was a flat disc mounted on a vertical shaft. The potter turned the wheel with one foot while shaping clay with both hands. This technique allowed for the creation of symmetrical vessels much faster than hand shaping. However, it required considerable practice to master medieval looms for weaving cloth, were wooden frames that held threads in place. The simplest looms were just rectangular frames. More complex looms had mechanisms for lifting alternate threads to speed the weaving process. All looms were operated by hand and required skilled workers to produce quality cloth. Medieval grinding stones for mills were carved from specific types of rock. The best stones came from quarries that produced hard, rough stone that wore evenly. Softer stones wore out quickly and produced poor flour. Harder stones lasted longer but were more expensive. Stone selection and installation required specialized knowledge. Medieval timekeeping devices were rare and primitive. Most people judged time by the sun's position or the ringing of church bells. Sundials worked only during daylight hours and clear weather. Water clocks and candle clocks provided rough time measurements but were not very accurate. Most daily activities were timed by natural rhythms rather than precise schedules. Medieval health and medicine were based on ancient theories and folk remedies rather than scientific understanding. Most villagers relied on herbal treatments, religious prayers, and traditional practices that had been passed down through generations. Professional medical care was available only to the wealthy, leaving common people to treat themselves or seek help from local wise women. Medieval medical theory was dominated by the concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to result from imbalances among these humours. Treatment involved restoring proper balance through diet, exercise, bloodletting, and purging. This theory had some practical value, but was based on incorrect assumptions about human physiology. Medieval bloodletting was a common treatment for many ailments. Physicians believed that removing excess blood would restore humoral balance and cure disease. Blood was drawn by making cuts in veins or applying leeches to the skin. This practice was often harmful and sometimes fatal, especially when performed on patients who were already weak from illness. Medieval herbal medicine used plants that grew locally or could be obtained through trade. Common medicinal herbs included willow bark for pain relief, chamomile for digestive problems, and mint for stomach upset. Some herbal remedies were genuinely effective, while others had no medical value. Knowledge of herbal medicine was often mixed with superstition and ritual. Medieval wise women served as healers and midwives in village communities. These women learned their skills through apprenticeship and experience. They knew which herbs to use for specific conditions and how to prepare medicinal preparations. However, their knowledge was often incomplete and sometimes dangerous. Wise women were sometimes accused of witchcraft when their treatments failed. Medieval childbirth was dangerous for both mothers and babies. Many women died from complications during delivery or from infections afterward. Infant mortality was extremely high, with perhaps half of all children dying before age 5. Midwives provided what assistance they could, but they lacked understanding of sanitation and had no effective pain relief. Medieval surgical procedures were primitive and extremely dangerous. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Patients often died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Common procedures included amputating injured limbs, removing bladder stones, and treating cataracts. Only the most desperate patients submitted to surgery because survival was unlikely. Medieval dental care was limited to tooth extraction when pain became unbearable. Dental decay was common because of poor diet and lack of oral hygiene. Tooth extraction was performed by barbers or traveling tooth pullers using crude instruments. No effective treatment existed for dental infections, which sometimes spread and caused death. Medieval diets significantly affected health and disease patterns. Most villagers ate monotonous diets based on bread, porridge, and ale. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only during certain seasons. Meat and dairy products were expensive luxuries. This limited diet caused nutritional deficiencies that increased susceptibility to disease. Medieval food contamination was a constant threat to health. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly in warm weather. Contaminated grain could cause ergot poisoning, which produced hallucinations and sometimes death. Spoiled meat caused food poisoning. Contaminated water spread diseases like dysentery and cholera. People had no understanding of the connection between sanitation and disease. Medieval epidemic diseases periodically devastated village populations. The Black Death of the 14th century killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Smallpox, measles, and influenza were recurring threats. These diseases spread rapidly through crowded, unsanitary villages. Medical knowledge was powerless against epidemic diseases. Medieval life expectancy was much shorter than modern standards. Average life expectancy was probably around 30 to 35 years. However, these statistics are misleading because of high infant mortality. People who survived childhood had reasonable chances of living to advanced ages. Nevertheless, life was harsh, and many died young from disease, accident, or violence. Medieval personal hygiene was generally poor by modern standards. Most people bathed infrequently because heating water was expensive and time-consuming. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, but was not widely available. Clothes were washed occasionally but not regularly. Poor hygiene contributed to the spread of disease and infestation by parasites. Medieval parasites were common health problems. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs infested clothing and bedding. Intestinal worms were widespread due to poor sanitation. These parasites caused discomfort and contributed to malnutrition. People accepted parasites as normal parts of life and had few effective treatments for controlling them. Medieval mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to supernatural causes. People with mental health problems were sometimes thought to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. Treatment might include prayers, exorcism, or physical restraint. Some mentally ill people were cared for by their families, while others became beggars or outcasts. Medieval disability posed serious challenges in agricultural communities. People with physical disabilities had difficulty performing farm labor. Those with severe disabilities might become dependent on family members or religious institutions. However, some disabled people found ways to contribute to village life through specialized skills or crafts that did not require physical strength. Medieval accidents were common and often resulted in permanent disability or death. Farm tools and machinery caused injuries. Animals kicked or trampled workers. Falls from roofs or trees caused broken bones. Burns from cooking fires were frequent. Without modern medical treatment, even minor injuries could become serious problems. Medieval pain relief was limited to a few natural substances. Alcohol was commonly used as an anesthetic for minor procedures. Opium was available but expensive. Willow bark contained compounds similar to modern aspirin. However, most people simply endured pain because effective relief was not available. Chronic pain was accepted as a normal part of life. Medieval pregnancy and contraception were poorly understood. Women had little control over when they became pregnant. Large families were common, but so was infant mortality. Some herbs were believed to prevent pregnancy or cause miscarriage, but these were often ineffective or dangerous. Family planning was largely left to chance or divine will. Medieval evening routines began as daylight faded and the church bells rang for vespers. This marked the end of the working day for most villagers. People gathered their tools and returned home from fields and workshops. Animals were brought in from pastures and secured for the night. Houses were prepared for the long hours of darkness ahead. Medieval lighting was expensive and limited. Most families could afford only a few candles or oil lamps. These provided dim illumination that made detailed work difficult. Candles were made from animal fat or beeswax. Oil lamps burned various oils, including olive oil, in wealthy households. Most evening activities had to be planned around the available light. Medieval fireplaces provided both light and heat during evening hours. Families gathered around the fire to share meals, tell stories, and perform simple tasks. The fireplace was the social center of the medieval home. Children learned family history and cultural traditions through evening conversations around the fire. These gatherings strengthened family bonds and transmitted knowledge. Medieval evening meals were usually simple affairs. The main meal of the day was eaten in late afternoon. Evening food might consist of bread, cheese, and leftover soup or stew. Ale was the common drink for all family members. These meals were eaten by firelight and provided opportunities for family conversation and planning for the next day's work. Medieval storytelling was an important form of evening entertainment. Older family members told tales of local history, religious legends, and moral stories. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, and cultural transmission. Children learned about their heritage and proper behavior through these oral traditions. Professional storytellers occasionally visited villages and shared news from other regions. Medieval evening prayers were required of all Christian families. The household gathered to recite prayers and give thanks for the day's blessings. These prayers were usually simple formulas that everyone knew by heart. Religious observance in the home reinforced church teachings and provided comfort during difficult times. Prayer time also served as a way to review the day's events and plan for tomorrow. Medieval evening work continued by firelight when necessary. Women spun thread using simple spindles that could be operated in dim light. Men repaired tools and equipment. Children helped with simple tasks like preparing kindling or sorting materials. However, most detailed work was postponed until daylight, because poor lighting made it dangerous and inefficient. Medieval sleep patterns were different from modern habits. People went to bed shortly after sunset because candles and oil were expensive. They often woke during the night and spent time in prayer, conversation, or light work before returning to sleep. This segmented sleep pattern was considered normal and healthy. Most people slept 8 to 9 hours total, but in 2 separate periods. Medieval beds were shared by multiple family members. Children slept with parents or siblings. Servants shared beds with other household members. Privacy was unknown in medieval homes. Beds were warmed by shared body heat and extra blankets during cold weather. Wealthy families might have curtains around their beds too, provide some privacy and warmth. Medieval bedtime preparations were minimal. People simply removed their outer garments and lay down in their full undressing was unusual, except during summer heat. Nightgowns were luxury items owned only by the wealthy. Most people slept in the same linen garments they wore during the day. These garments were washed infrequently and often harbored lice and fleas. Medieval night security was a constant concern. Houses had heavy wooden doors that were barred from inside. Windows were shuttered and sometimes covered with heavy cloth. Valuable items were hidden or locked in wooden chests. Some villages posted night watchmen, But most families relied on dogs and neighbors for protection against thieves and wild animals. Medieval night sounds included owls, wolves, and other nocturnal animals. These sounds could be frightening to people who believed in supernatural creatures. Wolves were real threats that occasionally attacked livestock or even humans. Village dogs barked at unfamiliar sounds throughout the night. The darkness was filled with mysterious noises that imagination often transformed into supernatural threats. Medieval superstitions about nighttime were numerous and deeply held. People believed that evil spirits were more active in darkness. They thought certain prayers and rituals could provide protection. Holy objects like crosses and relics were kept near beds. Salt was scattered around doorways to keep out evil. These beliefs reflected genuine fears about the dangers that darkness might bring. Medieval dreams were considered messages from God or warnings about the future. People paid careful attention to their dreams and often sought interpretation from priests or wise women. Nightmares were thought to be attacks by demons or punishments for sins. Good dreams were signs of divine favor. Dream interpretation was an important part of medieval spirituality. Medieval winter nights were particularly long and difficult. Darkness lasted for 14 to 16 hours in northern regions. Heating was expensive and often inadequate. Families huddled together for warmth and companionship. Food stores dwindled as winter progressed. These long nights tested both physical endurance and emotional resilience. Medieval seasonal rhythms governed sleep patterns. Summer nights were short and people went to bed later. Winter nights were long and families retired early to conserve fuel and warmth. Spring and autumn provided moderate nights that allowed for more evening activities. These seasonal variations created natural rhythms that connected human life to agricultural cycles. Medieval communal sleeping was common in poor households. Extended families shared single rooms. Servants slept in kitchens or barns. Privacy was rare and considered unimportant. Communal sleeping provided warmth and security, but also facilitated the spread of diseases and parasites. Personal space was a luxury that few could afford. Medieval night emergencies required careful planning. Medical crises, fires, or attacks by bandits could occur at any time. Families kept emergency supplies readily available. They knew evacuation routes and had plans for protecting children and valuables. However, darkness made emergency response slow and dangerous. Many crises that occurred at night had tragic outcomes. As midnight approached in medieval villages, most inhabitants had settled into sleep. The night watchman made his rounds, calling out the hours and watching for signs of trouble. The church bells marked the passage of time with their regular chimes. These ancient rhythms of work and rest, repeated countless times across centuries, created the steady heartbeat of medieval life. The peaceful darkness of village nights, broken only by the gentle sounds of sleeping families and the distant call of the watchman, now guides us toward our own restful sleep. These timeless patterns of human rest, unchanged across the ages, lead us naturally into peaceful dreams of simpler times and ancient ways.